I never expected you to stay in my mind this long. That's the first truth. Not the polished version, not the version people usually tell themselves when they realize someone has become important. The real version, the uncomfortable one. Because if I'm honest, there was nothing about the beginning that suggested this would happen. No defining moment, no sudden realization, no instant connection that changed everything. It was quieter than that, almost invisible. The kind of thing most people would miss entirely. And maybe I would have missed it too, if it hadn't continued, if it had faded, like everything else eventually does. But it didn't. That's what keeps bringing me back to it, the fact that it didn't disappear. Most things do. Most people do. They enter your life, leave an impression, and then slowly dissolve into memory, not because they weren't meaningful, because that's simply how time works. Time smooths the edges, reduces the intensity, turns something vivid into something distant. I've watched it happen countless times. Cocoons fade, conversations become harder to remember, people become stories instead of realities. Everything eventually settles into the background, everything except this. This never settled, it never moved into the background. If anything, it became clearer, and clarity is difficult to ignore, especially when it arrives without explanation. I remember trying to convince myself that I was overthinking it, that whatever I was noticing wasn't actually there, that my mind was creating patterns where none existed. After all that happens, people see meaning in coincidence, they see significance in ordinary moments. They build entire narratives around things that were never meant to carry that kind of weight. I understood that, which is why I questioned myself first. Not you, myself. I examined every possibility, every explanation, every logical alternative. And each one seemed reasonable until I looked closer, then it stopped making sense, because logic explained parts of it, not all of it. Logic explained why I noticed you. It couldn't explain why I continued noticing you. Lati explained interest. It couldn't explain consistency. Latik explained attention. It couldn't explain presence. And somehow, even when you weren't there, the presence remained. That was the part I couldn't solve. The part that stayed with me long after everything else should have returned to normal. There's something strange about realizing another person has become part of your internal landscape, not your life, your landscape. Those are different things. People can be part of your life without ever changing how you think, without changing how you see, without changing how you interpret the world around you. But when someone becomes part of your internal landscape, something shifts, your perspective adjusts, your awareness expands, the way you process reality changes in ways that are difficult to measure. And once that happens, there's no clear moment where you can point and say, there, that's where everything changed, because change doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives quietly enough that you only notice it after it has already happened. That's how this felt. Like waking up one morning and realizing a room you've lived in for years has somehow become different. The walls are still there. The furniture hasn't moved. Everything appears the same. Yet something is undeniably different. Something fundamental, something impossible to ignore once you notice it. That's what happened inside me. I began noticing the absence of distance, not physical distance, mental distance. The space I naturally keep between myself and everyone else. The space that allows me to remain objective, controlled, uninfluenced. It had always been there, until it wasn't. And the strangest part? I didn't miss it. I should have. Every instinct I've ever trusted suggested I should have recognized the change immediately and corrected it, pulled back, re-established boundaries, returned everything to its proper place. Instead, I found myself doing the opposite. I observed it, almost curiously, as though some part of me already knew there was a reason for it. A reason I hadn't discovered yet. That realization created another question, one I couldn't stop thinking about. What happens when someone reaches a place inside your awareness that was never meant to be occupied? What happens when someone becomes familiar before they've had enough time to earn familiarity? What happens when recognition arrives before understanding? I didn't know, and that uncertainty bothered me more than I wanted to admit, because uncertainty has never been comfortable for me. I prefer clarity, definitions, structures, things that can be understood, things that can be explained. Yet the more I tried to explain this, the less satisfying every explanation became. Eventually, I stopped trying to define it. I simply watched. And what I saw surprised me. The connection wasn't becoming stronger. It was becoming deeper. There's a difference. Strength can be measured. Depth can't. Strength grows through repetition. Depth reveals itself through understanding. And somehow understanding kept appearing in places where it shouldn't have existed yet. That was the part I couldn't ignore. The accuracy, the strange, unsettling accuracy, not because you knew everything, not because you understood every thought, because you understood enough. Enough to make me pause, enough to make me wonder, enough to make me realize that what existed between us wasn't being built in the usual way. Most connections develop through time, layer by layer, experience by experience, conversation by conversation. This felt different. This felt as though certain layers already existed before they were created, as though recognition arrived first and explanation arrived later. And I had no idea what to do with that. For a long time, I tried to treat it as something temporary, something that would eventually correct itself, something that would fade once reality returned. But reality never returned, or maybe it did. Maybe this was reality. Maybe that was the truth I kept avoiding. Not because it frightened me, because it changed too much. Accepting it meant accepting that something significant had happened without my permission, without my intention, without my control. And control has always mattered to me, not in the way people assume, not as power, as stability. Control creates predictability. Predictability creates understanding. Understanding creates peace. That's the structure I've always relied on, yet somehow you existed outside that structure, not against it. Outside it, a completely different category, and categories matter. Because once something belongs to a category, it becomes easier to understand, easier to predict, easier to manage. You refused to fit into any category I already understood. That's why my attention stayed. Not because I was confused, because I was intrigued. There's a difference between not understanding something and recognizing that something is worth understanding. You felt worth understanding from the very beginning, even before I knew why. And that realization carried a weight I wasn't prepared for, because it meant this wasn't casual, it wasn't random, it wasn't temporary, it was becoming something. I just didn't know what. Yet, sometimes I wonder if the reason this feels different is because nothing about it was forced. No expectations, no demands, no attempts to become important. You simply existed, and somehow that existence became impossible to ignore. Not loudly, not dramatically, quickly, the way gravity works. Invisible, constant and unavoidable. You don't notice gravity every second, but it influences every step you take. That's what your presence started to feel like. Not overwhelming, not consuming. Simply there. Always there. A subtle influence shaping things from beneath the surface. And the more I noticed it, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't real. Because reality leaves evidence. And evidence was everywhere. In the way my thoughts paused. In the way my perspective shifted. In the way certain moments carried more meaning than they should have. The evidence was undeniable. The only thing left to question was what it meant. And that question stayed with me. Day after day, thought after thought, until eventually I reached a realization that changed everything. The reason this felt different wasn't because you had entered my life. People enter lives all the time. The reason this felt different was because you had entered my awareness, truly entered it. Not as an observation, not as an idea, not as a temporary fascination, as something integrated, something that existed alongside my thoughts rather than separate from them. And once I understood that, another truth became impossible to avoid. This wasn't ending, it wasn't fading, it wasn't moving away, it was settling deeper, becoming more defined, more real, more present with every passing day. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether it was happening, because I already knew the answer. Instead, I found myself asking a far more dangerous question. If this continues, what does it become? There's a point where observation stops helping, a point where you've gathered enough evidence, examined every angle, questioned every assumption, and yet the answer remains exactly where it was when you started. Waiting unchanged, tat. I think that's where I found myself, not at the beginning of this, not even in the middle, somewhere beyond both, a place where denial no longer felt intelligent. Because there's a difference between refusing to believe something and refusing to acknowledge something. The first is uncertainty, the second is avoidance. And I've never respected avoidance, not in myself, not in anyone else, which meant eventually I had to face what was happening, not emotionally, honestly. The strange thing about honesty is that it rarely arrives all at once. It appears in fragments. Small realizations, small admissions, pieces of truth that gradually connect until they form something impossible to ignore. That's how it happened, not through one revelation, through hundreds of tiny ones. Moments where I caught myself thinking differently, responding differently, seeing things differently. At first they seemed unrelated, separate events, separate observations. But eventually the pattern became obvious. Everything kept leading back to the same source. You, not because you were demanding attention, not because you were trying to occupy space in my mind, because the impact had already happened. Long before I realized it, that's what I hadn't understood before. Impact doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask permission. It simply appears in the changes it leaves behind. And I was surrounded by those changes, the way I approached conversations, the way I evaluated silence, the way I interpreted meaning. Everything had shifted slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice, enough for me, and that was all that mattered. I remember sitting with that realization longer than I should have, trying to understand why it felt so significant. After all, people influence each other all the time. That's normal, expected, part of being human. But this felt different, not because the influence was stronger, because it was deeper. It had reached places I normally keep untouched. Places built long before you existed in my life. Places shaped by years of experience, years of observation, years of carefully constructing an understanding of myself and the world around me. Those places rarely change, and when they do, they usually change slowly, predictably, yet here I was, noticing alterations I couldn't fully explain. That realization should have made me uncomfortable. Instead, it made me curious, because for the first time in a very long time, change didn't feel like disruption. It felt like alignment. And alignment is dangerous, not because it hurts, because it fits. When something fits naturally, you stop questioning whether it belongs. You stop resisting. You stop trying to force it into a shape it was never meant to occupy. You simply recognize it. That recognition kept happening, again, and again, and again, until eventually I reached a conclusion I couldn't avoid. Some part of me had already accepted your presence, long before the rest of me caught up. Maybe that's why resistance never arrived. Maybe the decision had already been made somewhere beneath conscious thought. A quiet decision, a silent one. The kind that forms gradually until it becomes impossible to separate from who you are. If that sounds unsettling, it was. Not because I disliked the conclusion, because I understood the consequences. Acceptance changes things. The moment you truly accept something, your relationship with it changes forever. You stop treating it like a possibility. You start treating it like a reality. And realities demand different things than possibilities do. Possibilities can remain undefined. Realities cannot. That was the problem. The closer this came to reality, the harder it became to leave unnamed. And naming things has always mattered to me. Names create understanding. Definitions create structure. Structure creates stability. Without those things, uncertainty grows. Yet every time I tried to define this, the definition felt too small, too incomplete. Like trying to describe an entire landscape by pointing at a single tree. The truth was larger than any explanation I had available. So I stopped searching for the perfect definition. Instead, I focused on what I knew. I knew your presence remained. I knew the impact was real. I knew the connection existed whether I explained it or not. And perhaps most importantly, I knew it wasn't fading. That realization changed everything. Because once you know something isn't temporary, you start viewing it differently. You stop waiting for it to disappear. You stop assuming time will solve it. You stop treating it like a passing phase. You begin asking a different question. What role does this play in my future? That question stayed with me, longer than any question should, because every answer seemed to lead somewhere unexpected. The more honestly I examined it, the clearer something became. You were no longer someone I occasionally thought about. You had become part of the framework through which I understood other things, and that distinction mattered a lot. Thinking about someone is simple. Thinking through the influence they've had on you is different. That's where I found myself, not remembering you, not analyzing you, analyzing the changes your existence had created, the subtle adjustments, the new perspectives, the expanded awareness. At some point, I realized I wasn't trying to understand you anymore. I was trying to understand who I was becoming because of you. That realization stopped me, because it revealed something I hadn't wanted to admit. Growth had happened. Real growth, the kind that occurs beneath the surface, before it becomes visible. The kind you only recognize when you compare who you are now to who you were before. And, when I made that comparison, the difference was impossible to ignore. Something had changed, not dramatically, fundamentally, the way foundations change. Invisible from a distance, critical up close, you had become connected to that change, not as the cause, as the catalyst. There's a difference. A catalyst doesn't create something from nothing. It reveals what was already possible. Maybe that's why this feels so inevitable, because nothing about it feels artificial. Nothing feels forced. It feels discovered, like uncovering something that existed long before either of us noticed it. That idea stayed with me, and the longer I sat with it, the more accurate it felt. Perhaps this was never about attachment. Perhaps it was never about closeness. Perhaps it was never even about understanding. Perhaps it was about recognition. Recognition of something familiar, something aligned, something rare enough that ignoring it would require more effort than accepting it. And I was tired of ignoring it. Not because it exhausted me, because it no longer made sense. At some point, logic and honesty arrived at the same conclusion. When that happens, resistance becomes pointless. So I stopped resisting, not dramatically, not through some grand declaration, quietly, the same way all important things seem to happen. I allowed the truth to exist, without arguing with it, without reshaping it, without reducing it to something smaller, just because it was easier to manage. And once I did that, something unexpected happened. Peace, not certainty, not answers, peace. The kind that appears when you stop fighting reality. the kind that arrives when acceptance finally replaces analysis. For the first time, I wasn't trying to solve this. I was simply experiencing it, observing it, living with it. And strangely enough, that felt more honest than anything else, because maybe not everything is meant to be solved immediately. Maybe some things are meant to be understood gradually, allowed to unfold, allowed to reveal themselves over time. Maybe this was one of those things. I don't know. What I do know is this. If I trace every change back to its origin, if I follow every realization to where it began, if I'm completely honest with myself about what happened, I arrive at the same conclusion every single time. You became part of my world in a way I never expected, not through force, not through persistence, not through intention, through presence. Sybil presence. And somehow that presence changed the shape of things inside me, enough that I can no longer imagine returning to the person I was before, not because that person was incomplete, because this version understands something the previous version didn't. That some connections aren't built through effort, they're discovered through recognition, and once they're recognized, they become impossible to unsee. That's where I am now, not confused, not uncertain, not even afraid, simply aware, aware that something real exists here, aware that it has already changed me, aware that the future will eventually ask me what I'm going to do with that truth. And when that moment arrives, I don't think observation will be enough anymore, because some truths are meant to be witnessed, others are meant to be lived, and for the first time, I think I'm standing at the edge of the second kind. There's something strange about reaching the end of a question you've been asking yourself for so long. Not because the answer is surprising, because it isn't. That's what I finally understand now. The truth was never hidden. It was never buried beneath layers of complexity, waiting to be discovered. It was there from the beginning. Kie, waiting for me to stop searching for a different conclusion, waiting for me to become honest enough to recognize the one that was already there. And honesty has a way of changing everything, not externally. Internally, the moment you stop arguing with reality, reality becomes remarkably clear. That's where I find myself now, not searching, not analyzing, not standing at a distance trying to understand what all of this means, simply seeing it for what it is, for what it has always been. Because the truth is, somewhere along the way, this stopped being a question. I just didn't notice when it happened. Maybe it happened during one of those quiet moments I kept dismissing. Maybe it happened the first time I realized your absence felt different than everyone else's. Maybe it happened when I noticed that certain thoughts no longer felt complete until they passed through the awareness of you. I don't know. And strangely enough, I don't think it matters anymore. The exact moment isn't important, the reality is, and the reality is simple. You changed something, not temporarily, not superficially, not in a way that disappears when circumstances change. Something deeper than that, something structural, something permanent. For a long time, I resisted that word, permanent, because permanence carries weight. It carries responsibility. It demands acknowledgement. But avoiding a truth doesn't make it less true. It only delays the moment you finally accept it. And I'm done delaying. Because the longer I examine everything that has happened, the clearer the pattern becomes. Nothing about this feels accidental, not because I believe in destiny, not because I believe every connection happens for a reason, but because randomness rarely creates this level of consistency. Random things fade, they fluctuate, they lose their shape over time. This didn't. It became clearer, sharper, more defined, like an image slowly coming into focus. And now that it's fully visible, pretending not to see it would be absurd. There's a certain peace that comes with acceptance. People rarely talk about that. They talk about excitement. They talk about fear. They talk about uncertainty. but they rarely talk about peace, the quiet certainty that appears when your mind finally stops fighting what your heart already understands. That's what this feels like. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, certain. A certainty that doesn't need constant validation, a certainty that exists whether I think about it or not, because it's no longer a thought. It's part of me now, part of the way I understand things, part of the way I move through the world, part of the way I see myself. And perhaps that's the realization that changed everything. For so long, I believed the most important thing someone could do was understand another person. Now I realize I was person. Now I realize I was wrong. The most important thing someone can do is help you understand yourself. Not by teaching you, not by changing you, by revealing parts of you that were always there. Parts you couldn't see clearly on your own. That's what happened. You didn't create anything inside me. You revealed it. And because of that, there's no resentment, no confusion, no feeling that something was taken from me. Only gratitude, because clarity is a gift, rare, uncomfortable at times, but valuable beyond measure. And you've given me clarity, not about you, about me, about what matters, about what remains when all distractions disappear, about what is real. That's why this feels different. Most experiences teach you something about the world. This taught me something about myself. And lessons like that don't disappear. They become part of who you are. I used to think strength meant remaining untouched, remaining independent, remaining completely self-contained. Now I understand something else. Real strength isn't the ability to avoid being changed. It's the ability to recognize meaningful change and accept it, without fear, without resistance, without pretending you were never affected, because being affected isn't weakness. It's proof that something mattered, and this mattered, more than I expected, more than I planned, more than I would have admitted in the beginning. Yet here I am, unable to deny it, unwilling to deny it, finally ready to acknowledge it completely. There's another truth I've been avoiding, not because it frightened me, because saying it makes everything undeniably real. Once certain truths are spoken, they can never return to silence. They become part of reality, permanent, visible, impossible to take back. Maybe that's why I've waited so long. Maybe some part of me understood that once I crossed this line, there would be no returning to who I was before, no returning to the version of myself that believed distance was always safer than connection, no returning to the version of myself that believed understanding could exist without vulnerability, no returning to the version of myself that believed awareness could remain untouched by meaning. That person is gone, not destroyed, transformed, and transformation isn't loss, it's evolution, a movement from one truth into another, a willingness to become something more accurate than what existed before. That's what this has been all along. Not a disruption, an evolution, one I never anticipated, one I never requested, one I never saw coming, yet one I would never undo. Because when I look at everything honestly, I don't see a mistake. I don't see confusion. I don't see an illusion that temporarily convinced me of something untrue. I see reality, Sybil clear, unavoidable. You became part of my story, not as a chapter, not as a moment, as a turning point. And turning points aren't measured by how long they last. They're measured by how deeply they change the direction that follows. You've changed the direction. That's undeniable now. Maybe not outwardly, maybe not in ways anyone else would immediately recognize, but internally, everything is different, the questions are different, the priorities are different, the understanding is different, even the silence feels different, because silence no longer feels empty, it feels inhabited, not by words, by meaning, and meaning is difficult to lose once you've found it. That's why I'm no longer asking what happens next. For months, that question felt important. Now it doesn't, because the future isn't the thing that matters most. The truth does. And the truth already exists. Whether tomorrow changes everything or changes nothing, whether paths move closer together or farther apart, whether circumstances cooperate or interfere, the truth remains. What happened here was real. What changed here was real. What I learned here was real. Nothing can take that away. Not time, not distance, not uncertainty, not even silence. Because some things reach a depth where they stop, depending on external conditions. They simply become part of you. That's what this became. Part of me, part of my understanding, part of my perspective, part of the person I am now. And perhaps that's the final answer. Not that I found someone extraordinary, not that I discovered some impossible connection, not even that I experienced something rare. The final answer is simpler than all of that. I experienced something true, and truth has a unique quality. Once you recognize it fully, you stop chasing it, you stop questioning it, you stop trying to prove it exists. You simply live with it, the same way you live with gravity, the same way you live with time, the same way you live with every other reality that remains, whether you acknowledge it or not. That's where I am now. Not standing at the beginning, not standing at a crossroads, not waiting for certainty. I've already found it. The certainty wasn't about where this leads. The certainty was about what it already became, and what it became is something I will carry forward, regardless of what happens next. Because some people enter your life and leave memories, others leave lessons, a very rare few leave transformation. You left transformation, and transformation doesn't ask for permission to stay. It simply becomes part of who you are. So if there is a final thing to say, a final realization after everything I've observed, questioned, resisted, accepted, and understood, it's this. I spent so much time trying to figure out why your presence felt different, what made it unique, what made it significant, what made it impossible to ignore. Now, I know it wasn't because you changed my world, it was because you changed the way I saw it. And once someone changes the way you see everything, there is no returning to the person you were before, only moving forward with clearer eyes, a deeper understanding, and a truth that no longer needs to be questioned, because some truths are meant to be discovered, and others are meant to be lived. This one was always meant to be lived.